also working with Erwin, who's facilitating this this webinar today. Thank you so much for your time and for your patience.
Thanks, Stanford. So hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me and having me here. I must first say that I'm very happy to be here, but I was asked yesterday afternoon. So I haven't had much time to prepare, and I've had to pull up an old presentation of mine. And I spent the last few hours adapting it a little bit. But this is a presentation that I usually give to some of the social movements that my organization I work for, AIDC, that we do. But I hope that it's still interesting, and that we can have hopefully a good Q&A afterwards. I also haven't timed it. I really hope I'm within time, but one of you can just let me know if I've got to wrap up. But let me get started. So I'm sure many of you would have heard the term the ecological crisis, so not just the climate crisis. And there's a very important question, which is, why is it happening? And before we get into that question, I think it's useful to just start with, what do we mean by the ecological crisis? And I'm sure most of you know what ecology means. I actually studied ecology, and I still used to struggle to give a definition of what ecology means. But I quite like this definition. So the relations of living things to one another and to their physical surroundings. So kind of the ways that animals relate to each other, how they relate to plants as well, these kind of living things, but then also how they relate to the physical environment around them, like the climate, which is obviously a big issue for us all. Other term I like to introduce is biodiversity, and biodiversity kind of being all the forms of life that exist on Earth. And this is often what we're referring to when it comes to the ecological crisis, is that there's a crisis in biodiversity. And this biodiversity can be kind of the smallest organisms on the planet, such as these kind of phytoplankton, so microscopic plant cells that live in the sea, which are the base of the food chain for the largest animals that have ever existed, like the blue whale. And so the ecological crisis, I think the best place to start is to look at the historical record. And there have in fact been 5 major extinction events. And so you'll see in these kind of circles, there's percentages. And this is the percentage of biodiversity that was wiped out during these extinction events. And at the bottom, you can see how long ago this was, okay? So the first one being 445 million years ago. It's an incomprehensible length of time. And the most recent one being 66 million years ago, when a lot of the dinosaurs that we kind of know of were wiped out. And we are now approaching what could be the 6th mass extinction, and it's not from any sort of asteroid or natural disaster. It's from kind of the what has transpired through humanity's kind of impact on the planet. And I think one thing I want to leave with is, while you might say, well, look, there have been these extinction events in the past. The last one, 66 million years ago, that time is about 220 times the size of humans' existence. So Homo sapiens have been on the planet for around about 300,000 years. So the last time there was such a big mass extinction event it's an incomprehensible amount of time ago. If there's an extinction event for us, it's going to almost certainly be for all of humanity's future as well. And I want to bring up this graphic, which I find quite useful. It was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2015, and it's kind of called the 9 planetary boundaries, okay? And So each one of those little segments is meant to represent a boundary. And the red and the yellow is when we've supposedly crossed over a threshold. Okay, so when it's yellow, we've gone past what these scientists say the Earth can take, and as it goes into red, it's really starting to be a serious high risk. There is uncertainty around this, and the empty ones are often because there's not enough information yet. But you can see where it says biosphere integrity, that E over MSY, that's kind of just a function of biodiversity. This is to say that we've destroyed and gone over the limit of what biodiversity can take. Lower down, you'll see biogeochemical flows. So that's kind of referring to the excess nutrients that we've put into soils and waters, such as nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers. And you'll also see that we're approaching those boundary zones around freshwater, ocean acidification, and climate change. So yeah, that bottom picture is kind of meant to give you an example of what the impacts of biogeochemical flows. So this kind of pollution that often lands up in water sources. But we're kind of approaching these boundaries. In the case of climate change, we're already over what's safe. And this kind of gives you, I think, an overall sense of where the Earth is at. And then the big figures kind of only make it more concrete that we really are in a crisis. So about 3/4 of the land environment has been degraded, 2/3 of the marine environment. And we kind of know what this looks like. Over 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. And as we know that when a species is gone, we can't bring it back. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the time scale. Whilst when a species is extinct, something else might take its life. We're talking kind of millions and millions of years for life to kind of develop. So when something is gone, it really is gone. And so we have an urgent kind of duty to stop this. And of course, there's climate change, the thing that most people are talking about, and I believe kind of the central focus of this webinar series that you guys are doing. And climate change is having its impact on biodiversity as well. You might be able to see know what the image in the top right is. So on the left is a healthy coral reef. To the right is kind of what it looks like now after ocean acidification has kind of destroyed that entire ecosystem. You probably remember that there were big fires in Australia last year. It was estimated to be around about 1 billion animals died in those fires. And then, of course, people are suffering too. And it's not exclusively in countries of the global south, but these countries are absolutely feeling the brunt of it, both because the climate is most impacted in these areas, but also because they don't have the resources to deal with these catastrophes. So one thing I like to talk about is the storm that hit Texas a few years ago was stronger than the one that hit Mozambique, but kind of the scale of the damage was incomparable. And there's a huge amount of injustice around here. So this quite a useful graphic where about 50% of the world's population are accountable for almost none of the emissions, whilst the richest account for almost 50%. But I think there is a growing consciousness or a growing realization that, because of climate change, that we're also endangered, that there's a huge risk to humanity, to human society as we know it. And of course, there are people who have been resisting the kind of ecological destruction for decades, if not centuries. You might recognize the woman in the top left from the Amadiba Crisis Committee, who's trying to stop mining in the Eastern Cape. But I still like to use this quote by a guy called Chico Mendes, who kind of resisted early deforestation attempts in the Amazon. And he said, "At first I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. And now I realize I'm fighting for humanity." And I want to get now to kind of where I started, that there's this question. And this man in the bottom right, his name's John Bellamy Foster, and he says that environmentalists are not very good at asking, let alone answering this question. And this question being, why is this the destruction of the natural world happening? We can say, you know, what's happening, but why? Given that we know that this is, for the most part, people know that this is bad. We know that we rely on the natural world. Why does it keep getting destroyed? And this comes into what Owen was referring to, our kind of system change approach. And we see this destruction of nature being systematic. And so I would say you can go back to Marx and look at what he said very early on. And he speaks about capitalist production, and he says it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. It prevents the return of the soil of its constituent elements. Okay, so you can think of the metabolism in your body, that this kind of the metabolism of nature and man's relation to it is deeply disturbed by capitalist production. And he'll say the entire spirit of capitalist production, which is oriented towards the most immediate monetary profit, stands in contradiction to agriculture, and this is his word, and I've said nature, you could insert nature here, which has to concern itself with the whole gamut of permanent conditions of life required by the chain of human generations or species in general. So he spoke about essentially profit maximization, capital going to where it can make immediate and significant profits. And one of the backbones of that is the exploitation of labor, which I think most of us are quite familiar with. And essentially, capitalism, people who own businesses, own firms, are going to do their best to lower the wages, and that's one way of them getting as much profit as possible. The less they can pay for pay workers to do the labor that they need them to do, the better it is for their profits. Another component of this profit maximization can be kind of expanded on towards nature, and so you can also argue that nature is expropriated under capitalism, that capitalism and capitalists simply take from nature. It's almost like a free gift for them to sell. And I think it's quite similar to social reproduction, where again, where capital requires nature, it also requires social reproduction, but this kind of social reproduction is not paid for, it's not looked after, it's essentially just taken. And it's not just in terms of taking from nature without considerations for nature's reproduction, it's also dumping onto nature. I don't know if any of you guys are from Gauteng, but you might recognize that acid mine drainage water in the bottom. But of course, the emissions of CO2, of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are also a form of this dumping onto nature. Okay. And these images are quite, you know, stark, but I think they sum things up quite well. I mean, the one issue I have with the one on the bottom is that it kind of makes the workers on par with the business leaders, but there really is a process where nature is kind of shoved into our economic mode of production to produce profit with no kind of consideration for nature itself. I don't know if you guys, when you spoke about, or when you had a webinar about COVID, that there was any sort of analysis on where COVID came from. But this concept of zoonosis, so viruses that previously exist in animals and how they come into contact with human beings. And there's this language of these pathogens, these viruses, bacteria being contained in nature, but we eventually shake them loose. Okay, so a lot of these viruses that I've got there have origins in the natural world. Most of them come from animals, many from wildlife, and there are people like Rob Wallace and Mike Davis who have written about how capitalist agriculture in particular is kind of bringing these viruses into our spaces. And it's quite similar with the coronavirus. We know it existed as a bat. We're not entirely sure. I haven't read the latest update from the World Health Organization, but we're still not really sure what the intermediate carrier of it was. Some people say it was a pangolin, but it eventually found its way to people, and the rest is history. It's a very early image, actually, that one in the corner. But if we go back to this picture and we look at what that might look like, and you can see what happens, that this is what happens on the frontiers of nature, where we basically go into it, in this case burn it down, and put our kind of agriculture right on the borders of this now heavily disturbed nature. And we build things like factory farms, so animals that are often very sick, have weak immune systems that need to be propped up by antibiotics. And this is very happy for a virus. If a virus manages to move, just jump across the fence into those cows, it's very easy for it to reproduce itself and eventually mutate into something that can latch onto people. So there's another bit of language from Marx that I like to use, where he says capital can't abide a limit. It has to turn it into a barrier, which it then circumvents or transcends. Okay, so whenever there's something that's going to get in the way of profit maximization, this is not going to be seen as we need to stop now. It has to be overcome. And one of the examples, probably the most insidious examples, are with regard to climate change. So two of the largest fossil fuel companies, Exxon and Shell, they knew about climate change before the general public. You can see this this report by Shell. I forget the date, but it's in the 80s, on the greenhouse effect. Okay. Exxon knew about what they were doing towards causing global warming, but actually spent around $31 million trying to say that climate change doesn't exist. And this was their research, which was saying that it does. I think we've moved quite a long way from climate denialism. That's not to say there aren't serious climate denialists and that they aren't a problem, but I would say the majority of the world's powers have acknowledged climate change and acknowledged it as a big problem. And you could now add Joe Biden having taken over for Trump, and these are the major world leaders saying, we want to deal with climate change. Climate change is going to be catastrophic, and we need to do something about it. And then you might also read headlines like this. There really are a lot of them. The big green bang, how renewable energy became unstoppable. And you might hear about all the renewable energy that's been built in Germany and Denmark, and you might think that we're on the road to some sort of transition, but we really aren't. This is renewable electricity, still only 25%. Most of it is hydropower, very, very little of it is wind and solar. And this is just electricity. Electricity is only a component of the energy that we use. So think of all the petrol that we use, the oil. This is still overwhelmingly coming from fossil fuels. But the most scary and damning graph, I would say, is this one. And this is a graph of new investment in renewable energy. And if you look from 2005 to 2010, you might you might have been quite optimistic, you know, rates of 50% increases. But the last 10 years have been the opposite. And we've even had some drops in investment. And so we're not even close to investing the amount of resources into renewable energy that we need, because renewable energy simply isn't profitable enough. The thing about energy is if you're going to make it profitable, someone has to be buying that energy at a high enough price to guarantee profits. And so as the price of renewable energy has come down, so too have the profits. And so we have this fall in investment. And we know what that fall in investment means. Scenes like this just become more and more frequent. And so we can't rely on capitalism to fix its own problems. We can look at the staggering failure of the carbon price to see that the price is now literally back where it started. We can look at companies like BP responsible for dumping oil in the Gulf of Mexico. I can't imagine what percentage of emissions are due to BP, telling us that we need to go and calculate our individual carbon footprint, kind of shedding the responsibility away from them and onto the individual. And so what the future we might have under this kind of paradigm is a bit more renewable energy, but still the same climate disaster. And I think it's really important to say that there are no brakes on capitalism, that all capitalists face competition. If someone decides to stop or to try to do something differently, they're just going to be replaced. So it's really important to grapple with the systemic nature of this crisis. So I hope, and I think it is for many people increasingly clear that as nature shrinks, as capital grows, you might not agree with me that socialism is the cure, and I'm not today going to try to convince you that it is, but perhaps I've convinced some of you that capitalism is the disease, and that we do need to look at slogans like system change, not climate change. And some people are taking up this call under slogans such as this. And I would go back, but I would go back to Chico Mendes again, and this quote of his I really like is, "Environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening." So we really need to build class struggle. We need to carry on from where many of the youth around the world, and including in South Africa, have taken us, but they definitely can't do it alone. It has to be a much wider struggle that mobilizes social movements, that mobilizes trade unions. And I think in South Africa, we don't have to look much further than austerity and the economic paradigm that our government seems to want to deliver us into, of cuts and privatization. I don't know if you guys have kind of looked at the latest budget, but cuts to health, essentially cuts to social grants, wages, and we need to tell our finance minister that his budget is as terrible as his cooking. So I'm gonna leave it there, and thank you so much.
Okay, that was indeed a nice summary of the whole climate crisis and the system change that is needed. I haven't seen too many questions in the chat yet. Oh wait, yes, here Andries has a question. Yeah, that's actually also where I would like to start. Like you address the problem. So what are the alternative economic models? You talk about socialism. What would a green version of socialism look like? And yeah, where do you see opportunities? There are debates that we are a little too late and that corporations will always do as they please. Yeah, how do we constrain the power of corporations who are basically setting the agenda?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's the most important question. I do think the answer is quite simple, but achieving the answer is incredibly difficult. And the answer is to build counterpower. You can't control corporations until you have some sort of power to do so. And of course, we would hope that the government and the state, who we vote for, which supposedly acts on our behalf, would do this. But of course, the state is incredibly entangled with corporations as well. Our president is a billionaire. It's very easy to buy off politicians. There's various reasons why it's very hard to build a state that really takes on corporations. But I think all of us would say that social movements are very important. Certain social movements have achieved really great things when they've mobilized lots of people. The Treatment Action Campaign is kind of the most obvious example in South Africa's recent history, what it was able to do around HIV. But I would say trade unions and workers remain the most effective way to check corporations' power, because what capitalists do care about, corporations do care about, are their profits. That is what they need. And workers are the only ones who can shut that down. It's much harder for workers to do this, not just because of new laws, not just because of their own problems in unions, and the fact that these workers' fates are often tied to the profits of these corporations. So this is why I say it is difficult, but this is the area we need to go, and we need to kind of reinvigorate class struggle through social movements and organized labor. And so this is what the AIDC tries to do. We do have social movement partners that we work with, and we try and support them. And part of that is through research. And our most kind of, I would say, recent developments have been around Eskom. So we have a report. I thought I could just share my screen once more. Just give me a second. Eskom Transformed. I'll post the link in the chat, but it's kind of our flagship research report around the energy transition, where we basically are calling for Eskom to not be unbundled, to remain a vertically integrated utility that can really lead the just transition. And to be clear, we're not arguing that Eskom isn't in a deep crisis, and that's why the report is called Eskom Transformed. But it comes back to what I was talking about, the failure of the private sector in dealing with climate change, and the need for us as the public and the public sector to lead the just transition.
Anybody else? Would I see if people raise their hands, or because, or is that only the chair?
There's another question in the chat, Aaron.
There's okay. Cornelia asks a question here. Yeah. So in an economy that is increasingly becoming more capitalistic, can we really have the best of both worlds, where environment or nature is at equilibrium with development or the so-called progress? How can this be balanced, if it can at all? That's a very good question. I also like, can we have the benefits of progress, modernity, and stabilize the economy, or take a step back, or how is that possible? I always wonder what will an economy look like if it shrinks? How would we feel that? How would we experience that?
Yeah. So this is I'm looking for an essay on the internet right now. I'll try to find it later. This gets to the heart of a really big debate on the left. I'm someone who's increasingly of the view that we don't need to step back from development, modernity, technology. These are all good things. The problem is that when they are guided by profit maximization. So someone did a very good Twitter thread, which I really liked, and he said, let's say the Soviet Union, and I don't want to make a defense of Soviet Union, just as a thought experiment, that the Soviet Union won and most of the world was under some sort of socialist mode of production. It's highly likely that we would still have climate change. We would still have had factories, we still would have burnt coal. However, because there's no longer the absolute imperative is to make money and profits under socialism, society can adjust and say, look, even if we're going to lose money, even if we have to shut this industry down, we can stop burning coal. And this is kind of the heart of what I would call as a socialist modernism, which says, we don't need to run away from technology. It's not about that growth is wrong, but it's about infinite growth and the way that growth is measured now. We can, once we divorce these processes from the need to endlessly make as much money as possible, as fast as possible, these look very different. The other argument, which I think is really important, is I think it's a non-starter for us. Even if I was poor, working class, and black, for me to go into a township and say, well, actually, we need less. We need to have less. There's too much stuff. We need to have a vision that actually brings more to the vast majority of people. And I don't think that's incompatible with the environment. It just means that we have to plan. It means we have to do kind of less mining, but we're still probably going to need to do mining. But how we mine, where we mine, the way workers are treated, communities around those mines are treated would be different. What we need is public transport for everyone. We need to build trains. We need to build houses. I don't think I think it's a mistake to move away from that. I do think I'm probably simplifying and maybe not doing justice to some of the arguments that people from the degrowth camp make. And I'll try to post some links before I leave. But yeah, I don't think I think we can have the best of both worlds, where we protect the environment and we have development and what I think many of us understand as progress. But it can't involve capitalism.
Okay, I see another hand up from Sia Mama.
Yeah, just a question for Bruce. Why does Chico Mendes follow him wherever he goes? And what are climate jobs? Those are my questions.
Why does Chico always follow me?
Yeah.
So Sia, in some ways, Sia is my boss. Many of you won't know that. So he's seen this presentation before, and he's just making sure that I'm doing a good job. And he's also put me on to a path that's really important to talk about, which kind of touches on what I was just saying. There is a lot of opportunities around moving to a low carbon economy through jobs. So we would say that jobs in renewable energy, jobs in public transport, that these should be viewed as climate jobs. These are jobs that are good for the climate, and there can technically be a lot of them. The one danger, however, is that, again, if the transition is left to capitalism, there aren't going to be a lot of jobs, and particularly in South Africa, because most of the jobs, unfortunately, when it comes to renewable energy, are in manufacturing. And we've decided that our renewable energy future will be led by the private sector, and the private sector wants to have the cheapest possible inputs that it can, the cheapest labor. And so the latest round of bids for renewable energy, they imported all of their solar panels from China. So we're not creating the jobs that can potentially be made by developing our own renewable energy sector. And it's just another example where the goal is less about clean energy than profit. So climate jobs is a very useful tool for us as activists, progressives, when we speak to people, when we speak to the coal miner, the person who's in some old job in the fossil economy, and we say, that stopping climate change doesn't mean that there won't be jobs, but at the same time, a transition might actually mean less jobs. I think that's a really scary reality that we have to grapple with. It doesn't have to, but it requires the transition to happen under a different paradigm.
But yeah, that different paradigm may also be shorter work weeks and yeah, more leisure time and things like that.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that's also some like alternative economic models that incorporate that much more in. So there's more questions. So what needs to change regarding public participatory processes and engagement in order to bring about system change? Oh, actually linking to this previous statement, if people have more time, they have more time also to participate in public debates.
Well, so, I'm glad you said that, Owen, because I think that's actually the best. That's what socialism is about for me, is actually for us to have more control over our lives and to have more time to do what we find meaningful. And work doesn't have to also be a wage. If you want to do art, if you want to do sport, if you want to look after your child, that's also work. And these things are important. And the socialist vision, there would probably still be jobs, there would be work for people who wanted to work, but it's definitely not an obsession with jobs. I think we just have to accept that we are in the here and now, and we have to go to people where they are. So where I might want to say to someone in a job, fight for socialism, you won't necessarily even have to work. They understandably are going to look at me like I'm crazy, and in a sense I would be. So I think it is important to own the jobs discourse and to say in a country like South Africa, that we can bring about more employment, and that's not to exclude things like basic income grants and other social security. So then the question, like, what needs to change regarding public participatory processes and engagement? So I would go back to, we have to build our own power. And, we're all very weak and limited as individuals, unless you're someone with a huge amount of money, but then you don't really want to change the system. But, when we come together, lots of people have a lot more power. So I think it's firstly about organizing yourselves, organizing around other people, around a common, something that unites you. I would say it's very important to be part of organizing that is rooted in the working class. And I am not by any means a member, nor have I ever been of the working class, but I still feel very welcome in working class struggles and spaces. But it's the working class people are the ones who have the most stake in the game. They're the ones who are going to actually resist capitalism, because it's what's ultimately destroying their lives and oppressing them. To be more specific, I think once you have that power, then you can have meaningful participation and engagement. Because I think what happens is that there's a lot of box ticking exercises by government, by corporates. They might say, we spoke to this community. They might say, we had this kind of dialogue and we said this and that. But at the end of the day, they don't really have to do what you say, because they can just ignore you because you don't have power. So I think there are kind of administration, there are kind of ways you can tweak the political system to make it more responsive to people, to allow people to participate better. There's a strong case to overhaul our electoral system, for example, but you're not going to do that until you actually build the power that can bring about those changes. So I would really look at building power, building social movements, and then rebuilding labor. Should I just go to the next question?
Yeah, there is. Oh, in the meantime, there's already 2 more questions on the chat.
Yeah, from Kehinda.
Kehinda says, did you engage in discussing what role does dwindling traditional knowledge of various communities in their respect for nature? Yeah, so this is also cultural, basically. Oh, the discussion goes fast now. So what role does it play if we just learn to appreciate nature?
Yeah. So I think I said in my one slide, you know, the fights against the struggles for nature, to defend nature, have overwhelmingly been led by indigenous peoples around the world, and continue to do so. And I think it is that kind of message that is behind their struggle, of not seeing nature as this completely separated thing that is just there to be exploited, that is really inspiring and really powerful. Unfortunately, and this is where you must take this as strictly my opinion, I think that these communities are not going to be able to stop the destruction of nature. I think that the structure of the system, the power of capital, just means that a struggle that's actually going to halt capitalism, and I'm someone who believes that, I'm not someone who really thinks there's going to be a revolution. I think we're going to have stages where we slowly reduce the power of capital towards maybe something where you could have socialism. But I don't think that small indigenous communities, often in rural areas, kind of have the power to do this. I think they are going to have to be supported by a much bigger struggle that's going to come, I believe will have to come from within workers, particularly workers in urban centers. And this is based off a fairly traditional or orthodox Marxist idea around workers being able to actually shut down capital, being actually able to go on strike and shut the factory down. I mean, a really, really brutal thing to acknowledge is a lot of the heroes of ours in these local struggles have been murdered. Chico Mendes was assassinated. He was killed. The Ahmadiyya Crisis Committee have had various leaders of theirs killed or intimidated. These are groups that are incredibly brave, incredibly powerful in their own right, but I don't think they can lead this struggle. I think it's going to require something bigger. I think that's why, despite the absolute crisis, I mean, it makes us want to cry when we look at the state of our unions. I think we still have to not give up on the labor movement and focus a lot of our attention there.
Yeah, okay, I think I would agree with that as well. I just there's one more question. I'm not sure what the time limits are, so there I'm falling back for Andries, but I think we still have something like 5 minutes. But the last question is also about mining rights. What needs to change about how mining concessions are issued in order to empower communities? Is there a way, are there models for sort of how mining concessions are given out that incorporate community rights?
Sure. So I will plug my own organization here. We have a program called the Alternatives to Extractivism. And this is primarily around mining and the struggle against what we call extractivism, a certain kind of, it's not exclusively mining, but a way that capital extracts resources from people. And one of the big campaigns is the right to say no. So the idea being that if the communities don't want the mining on their land, they have the right to say no to that it needs their consent. So that's, for me, a very important thing to get behind. It raises difficult questions, though. You know, a lot of our communities aren't necessarily democratic. There's disputes around who is the community. I think, again, the more power you give to workers, if we really have a joint worker and community struggle, workers have less interest in making sure that mining is as cheap and profitable as possible. A mine with much more worker control might be much more interested in making sure that their own safety is taken into account. The community that probably many of them come from is both benefits and is protected from the mine. And I think on then a more kind of macro scale, there needs to be a kind of planning around what minerals do we need to move ourselves to a low carbon economy. You know, we need a lot of cobalt, and that has huge implications for the DRC and what's happening to people there. There's lithium for electronic vehicle batteries. So I think getting to grips with mining, which I believe, you know, has to continue, because we have to build renewable energy, we have to build these kind of infrastructures, but it has to happen differently, and communities having a big say and control in that process is paramount.
Yeah, I see a few more comments still that also follow up a bit on this thinking about mining. And so first we have, following on Kehinder's inquiry, how can we integrate African traditional philosophy, which appears to be so in harmony with environmental conservation and reversing the metabolic rift that Marx talks about? I'm not sure whether because we don't have time to go in depth, but I just want to say what people are reflecting on. And
I'd like to quickly respond to that, if that's okay. So yeah. There's a lot of, I think, that's come with the kind of postmodern turn. There's a notion that, you know, Marxism is very old, it's very European, and it's always important, I think, to point out that the most successful and committed Marxist leaders have overwhelmingly come from the global South. Many of them have come from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and I think it's precisely because a lot of these, a lot of the philosophy, the culture in these regions resonates with what Marxism is ultimately about, which is against oppression and understanding that oppression is universalized, that capitalism produces oppression wherever it goes. And so I think lots of African philosophy would be in harmony with Marxism, and I also think, yeah, I think it's about using, I think, the power that Marx gives us through understanding capital and a kind of a path to how we overcome capitalism, and using your African philosophy, the culture, and wherever you are in the world, being able to blend the power of these processes, I think gives you a very powerful kind of politics to organize around and develop your struggle.
Okay, that's very much also the gist of the last comment. Like we have to integrate yeah, working class and traditional African philosophy. So that's, yeah, I guess there is a sort of consensus within this group, at least. Okay, I think Danford said he will close, so I'll leave the screen to Danford then.
Thank you so much, Erwin. Thank you so much, Bruce, for availing your time to contribute to our special series on climate justice. Thanks to everyone for attending. Please do join us next week for another seminar series on the climate justice. It will run till April. Thank you for attending. Same time, you get communication from the Center for Civil Society. Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.